Welcome back for part 2 of our deep dive into modern Indian history. If you're getting ready for the UPSC GS1 exam, or if you just really like this era, this is the place to be.
Yeah, and especially if you are interested in the power of ideas,
Ooh, I like that.
because that's what we're diving into today.
So tell me more.
We're looking at these religious reform movements in the late 19th and early 20th century.
Wow.
And these movements, they were really wrestling with this question of how do you hold on to who you are when everything is changing around you?
I love how you put that.
Yeah.
How do you hold on to your identity when everything around you is changing?
Mhm.
And we're going to look at 3 big movements, right? The Singh Sabha movement.
The Akali Movement.
And the Arya Samaj. And for our listeners out there who are focused on the UPSC,
Yes.
keep in mind that these show up all over the GS1 syllabus.
Absolutely.
So make sure you're taking notes.
And what's really interesting is how each of these movements kind of had a different answer to that question of identity.
Right.
Some wanted to go back to the roots. Others embraced some parts of modern ideas.
It's like they were choosing
Yeah,
from a menu of options.
exactly.
Okay, so let's jump right in. The Singh Sabha, they started in 1873. And one of the things they were really worried about was the influence of other religious groups on Sikhism.
Right. They felt that Sikhism was kind of losing its distinct identity.
Okay.
So they focused on promoting those traditional Sikh teachings and practices.
Yeah.
And a key thing they did was they established Khalsa schools.
So education was a big part of their reform efforts.
Exactly. If you control education, you can shape the next generation
Ooh, that's a good point.
and make sure that your traditions continue.
Yeah, and this is something we see throughout history, right?
Absolutely.
That education is so powerful for social change.
Powerful.
That's such a good point, especially for those of you thinking about the impact of these movements. Now, the Singh Sabha eventually leads to the Akali movement. What made the Akalis different?
Well, the Akalis were more politically active. One of their main goals was to take back control of the Gurdwaras, the Sikh places of worship,
Yeah.
from the Udasi Mahants.
Okay, wait, hold on, back up. Who are the Udasi Mahants?
Good question. These were hereditary priests
Okay,
who often controlled the finances and the administration of the Gurdwaras.
okay.
The Akalis argued that a lot of these Mahants weren't really aligned with the true spirit of Sikhism,
Interesting.
and they had become corrupt.
So the Akalis wanted to purify the Sikh religious institutions and practices.
Right.
Sounds like a direct challenge to the power structure.
Absolutely.
Bold move.
They were willing to put themselves on the line for this.
Yeah?
They launched all these nonviolent protests, satyagraha, to try and pressure the British government to hand over control of the Gurdwaras.
I'm already seeing some similarities to Gandhi's tactics later on.
Right.
Did they get what they wanted?
They did.
Really?
In 1922, the British government passed the Sikh Gurdwaras Act,
Wow.
which gave control back over to the Sikh community.
That's a huge victory.
It is.
And it shows how these movements could use nonviolent resistance
Yeah.
to get what they wanted.
Right. And this tactic Gandhi himself would later use.
Yeah, it highlights this growing political consciousness within these religious movements.
Absolutely.
The Akalis were fighting for religious freedom, but they were also becoming really important players
Right.
in this bigger movement for Indian independence.
Absolutely.
This is a big one for our UPSC listeners out there.
Yeah.
You can really see how religion and politics were so intertwined during this period.
Intertwined.
And that's a theme that we're going to see come up again and again.
Yes.
Okay, so now let's switch gears and talk about the Arya Samaj, a Hindu reform movement started by Swami Dayananda Saraswati. They were also concerned with keeping Hindu identity, but their way of doing things was a little different.
It was.
So tell me about that.
Well, they were focused on education,
Okay.
but their main emphasis was on going back to the Vedas,
The Vedas.
the ancient Hindu scriptures.
So-
Dayananda believed that the Vedas had all the knowledge, all the wisdom you needed for a good life,
Right.
and that Hinduism had kind of strayed too far
From its original purity.
from that original purity.
So they were kind of like the Singh Sabha
Yeah,
in that they wanted to revive this true essence of their faith, right?
exactly.
But instead of focusing on specific practices,
Yeah.
they were looking at the core texts.
The core text.
And like the Akalis, they also challenged those power structures. But this time, it was within Hinduism itself.
Exactly.
They criticized those traditional Hindu rituals and practices that they saw as superstitious
Yeah,
against the Vedas.
very much so.
It sounds like they weren't afraid to shake things up a bit. Do they have any social reforms in mind?
Oh, absolutely. They were very progressive when it came to social issues.
Like what?
For example, they were big on raising the minimum marriageable age
Oh, wow.
for boys and girls.
That's interesting. So it sounds like they were really trying to balance tradition with a more modern view.
Yeah.
But didn't they also start the Shooty movement? That one sounds a bit controversial.
Yes. The Shooty movement was definitely a point of contention.
Why is that?
Well, it aimed to bring people who had converted to other religions,
Okay.
like Christianity or Islam, back into Hinduism.
So they were trying to strengthen Hindu identity.
Yes.
Not just through internal reform, but by bringing back those they believed were originally Hindu.
You got it.
But I can see how that would cause some issues with other religious communities.
Yeah, for sure. And it's important to remember that this wasn't just some abstract idea.
Right.
It really affected people's lives
Okay.
and their relationships.
A key takeaway for our UPSC listeners out there.
Right.
The Arya Samaj, like those other movements we talked about, shows how religion could be such a powerful force
A powerful force.
in shaping social and political stuff.
Absolutely.
And remember, the Arya Samaj wasn't just one big group. There were different ideas about what reform even meant.
Different interpretations.
After Dayananda died, the Arya Samaj split into two main groups.
That's right.
Tell me about those.
You had the college party.
Okay.
They liked English education and modern science in their classes.
So very forward-looking.
And then you had the Mahatma Party.
Okay.
They preferred the more traditional approach,
Yeah.
emphasizing that Gurukul system.
It's almost like a mini version of that big debate happening across India at that time.
Exactly.
How much should we embrace Western ideas versus sticking to our own traditions?
And this split within the Arya Samaj really had a lasting impact on the way schools developed within the Hindu community.
So fascinating.
If you're getting ready for the UPSC, pay attention to how the Arya Samaj's emphasis on Vedic texts connects to debates about Hindu nationalism later on.
Ooh, that's a good one. Okay, so we've got these three really interesting movements. The Singh Sabha focused on education and really making that Sikh identity strong. The Akalis, who took a more political approach and challenged the British. And the Arya Samaj, who were all about going back to that Vedic purity, but also pushing for social reforms. It seems like they were all dealing with this feeling of being stuck between tradition and the modern world.
That's a really great point. And it wasn't just these organized movements either.
Oh, really?
Think about individuals like Gopal Hari Deshmukh,
Gopal Hari Deshmukh.
also known as Lokar Hitawadi,
Okay.
who really embodied that whole reform spirit.
Right, he was the one who said that radical thing.
Yeah,
If religion doesn't approve social reform, then change the religion.
that's the one.
Putting social progress above strict tradition. Pretty bold for that time.
Very bold.
How did Deshmukh's ideas connect with groups like the Arya Samaj, who are also about reform?
Well, his focus on reason and humanism
Okay.
and equality really lined up with some of the Arya Samaj's core values. Remember, they were pushing for things like raising the marriageable age, which challenged traditional social norms.
But didn't some people say that the Arya Samaj's focus on Vedic purity actually made Hinduism less inclusive
That's a fair point.
rather than more?
It highlights the complexities and the contradictions within these movements.
Right.
The Arya Samaj wanted to bring back what they saw as the true Hinduism,
Yeah.
but not everyone agreed with their take on it.
So even though they were all working for a better future, they didn't always agree on what that future should look like.
Right.
It makes you wonder how these different visions played out for everyday people who are caught in the middle of all this.
I know. Imagine being a young Sikh student at a Khalsa school back then.
Wow.
You're not just learning about your religion, you're being prepared to defend who you are in a world where British influence was everywhere.
That's such a good point.
Or think about being a Hindu family, trying to figure out the Arya Samaj's calls for change. You might agree with some of their ideas, but not be ready to abandon all the old ways.
Such a tough situation.
These were real people making hard choices and trying to find their way.
Yeah. It wasn't just their story.
Right.
They're part of all our stories. Understanding this time in Indian history helps us understand why things are the way they are today.
So true. And it's a reminder that history isn't just about dates and events.
Right.
It's about people, their beliefs, their struggles, and the choices they made.
And it's about understanding how those choices still affect us.
Exactly.
All right, so we've covered so much in this deep dive.
We have.
We looked at three big religious reform movements: the Singh Sabha, the Akali Movement, and the Arya Samaj. And we even talked about some key people like Gopal Hari Deshmukh. What's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I think it's really important to remember that these movements weren't just about religious beliefs. They were totally tied up with social and political change. They were reacting to colonialism, trying to figure out what it meant to be Indian in this world that was changing so fast.
And they weren't afraid to challenge how things were done,
Absolutely not.
whether it was within their own groups or against British rule.
Right.
They used education, political activism, and social reform
Right.
to try and shape their own futures.
Exactly. And for those of you out there studying for the UPSC, you really got to understand all the little details of each movement, their leaders, their goals, and how they affected Indian society.
Yeah,
These movements pop up in essay questions all the time.
right.
And they can be used to show those bigger themes of social change nationalism
Exactly.
and the role of religion in politics.
Don't just memorize facts, though.
Right.
Really think about how everything connects.
Exactly.
How do these movements affect each other? How do they help the movement for independence? How do they shape the India we see today?
That's the key. And for everyone listening, whether you're studying for an exam or not, I think there's a really powerful lesson here about having the courage to challenge what's considered normal and to fight for something better.
Yeah.
These movements show us that social change often starts with passionate people and communities who say no to injustice and no to inequality.
It's so inspiring. These were regular folks who saw that things needed to change and did something about it.
They did.
And their impact is still here in our institutions, our laws, and the values that still matter in India today.
Before we finish up, I want to leave you with one last thought.
Okay.
Think about how these movements, the Singh Sabha, the Akali Movement, the Arya Samaj, are still affecting Indian society today.
Oh, that's a good one.
Look around, their legacy is everywhere. In schools, political groups, even in the debates we're still having, about social reform and what it means to belong to a religion.
It's like we're still living with the echoes of these movements.
Yeah.
And understanding their history helps us understand how complex India is today.
Exactly. So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep connecting the dots. Between the past and the present, there's always more to find out.
And don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive. For more deep dives into all sorts of fascinating topics, we'll be back soon with another episode to make you the most interesting person at your next dinner party. Until then, happy learning.